right, good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for a very important webinar for hopefully many of you that are on today's call. Anyone that also has joined us, you will be on listening mode, but we will have a Q&A at the end of the presentation. So if you have any questions that come up along the way, please put those in the question box. If for some reason we don't get through all your questions, we will follow up after the webinar along with the recording of this webinar today, usually within a couple days or no later than early the following week. Okay, so today's webinar, Pathway from GMP to GFSI, Food Safety Audits. My name is Denise Webster. If you've joined any of our webinars before, you know the spiel, but I'll give it to you anyways. I have 25 years in the food industry in all capacities, in manufacturing, CPG, and retail. I specialize in all of the BRC, SQF, FSMA, all the acronyms that are out there in the food safety space, both as a lead trainer and as a consultant. We also do very specific consultation around things like Prop 65, food labeling, regulatory advice, and overall just helping the industry where it's needed. So that is me. As far as SCS, likely you already know a lot about SCS, but for those of you that may be joining us for the first time, we are an international leader in third-party food safety, environmental, sustainability certification. We also have a standards development department and strategic consulting, where we do things like life cycle assessments and gap assessments for food safety, and it runs the gamut. We're actually celebrating our 40th year anniversary this year. In the food and ag side of our division, you can see some of those third-party audits we're going to talk about today. And we have a full portfolio of other things around our product claim labeling, so gluten-free, organic, pesticide-free, and sustainability. All right, so what are we going to talk about today? Well, I figured we'd start with just kind of a history of food safety audits. How did we get here? Just give everyone a little bit of framework for where we've been, where we are today, and where we're going to be going into the future. Also, that buzzword, GFSI, what does it mean? And why is it important? Who are they? And what really difference does it make in terms of that change from a GMP audit all the way to a GFSI? So we'll talk about those scenarios. We'll also realistically look at what are the timelines and what are the risks, and then also give you guys what we've kind of come up with 5 key strategies that hopefully will help prepare your programs to move in that direction, as well as your team. And as mentioned, Q&A. We'll first start with a poll question. So let me go ahead and open that poll up. So you'll see all the different types of food safety audits. Maybe you're already GFSI and you're here on this call anyways, or you maybe are on that journey with the global markets program like a BRC START or SQF. Okay, the poll is launched, or perhaps you have an SCS, GMP, or GAP, or maybe you are a farm or grower pack house. Maybe you have the USDA GAP or GMP, or kind of more of the regulatory ones. Or maybe none at all yet. You want to know what direction you should head. If there's any I missed, go ahead and put that in the chat box. I'll give you guys another 20 seconds or so to get your answers in. Okay, let's close that then. I think everybody's got a chance. And then I will share, because it's always interesting to see those results. So 50% of you are already on GFSI audit. So it's great that, maybe we can glean a little advice from you guys as well for the other percent, where we've got 15% of you are currently in that GMP or GAP area, plus we've got 12% in the USDA, and then 19% of you guys have no audit yet. So this is actually really timely for you, to be able to kind of figure out directionally, where do you want to go? Do you want to start with the GMP or a global markets, or do you want to just dive right into GFSI? That's a possibility, and we'll talk about the timelines and what it takes to kind of get there. Okay, well, thank you guys for sharing that with us. Let me just go ahead and hide that now. All right, so as promised, let's look at the history of food safety audits. I mean, no surprise, it kind of starts with, bad things happening, right? We're not the most proactive society, so, there's a lot of incidents that have occurred, in the past around outbreaks and, of course, unfortunate deaths. And, in the 1800s, there were, a lot of different things going on. Also, not only were there, outbreaks, occurring with consumption of food, but there was also a lot of food adulteration, that intentional addition or modification of the food to make it inferior or cheaper or non-authentic to increase, their value, but not the value to the consumer from a quality or safety and nutritional. So with, the overall dynamics of when these things happen, right, we end up having a precipice in the industry where something has triggered, an awakening, essentially. And one of those is that Upton Sinclair, The Jungle. This is, a book that was back in 1905, 1906, where it was detailing the harsh conditions and unsanitary practices in the meatpacking industry, and really kind of put a spotlight on food manufacturing. And with that, there were notable things occurring around some outbreaks and adulteration, just kind of coming together under President Theodore Roosevelt's watch. And so he signed into legislation, which essentially created the foundation for what we call the Pure Food and Drug Act. And it allowed us to also create the agencies like the USDA, and then after that, the FDA, giving them the legal authority to seize goods in interstate commerce that were adulterated or contained additives injurious to health, or filthy, decomposed, putrid substances, is essentially what the regulations noted. But it did take about 32 years later with Roosevelt's cousin, Franklin, and he then signed into act the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act. This was a broader and more specific scope, where now we're ensuring foods, drug, devices, and cosmetics that enter interstate commerce, meaning it crosses state lines, are not to be adulterated or misbranded. And even today, that FD&C Act ultimately is the foundation for any regulation. It still exists today, even with FSMA and all, anything else that kind of adds to it. We can always default to that food cannot be adulterated or misbranded. We obviously have the various product recalls and withdrawal legislation, and just generally misbranding and labeling issues from a regulatory perspective. And that's why we get audited, right, by the FDA or the USDA, depending on if we're meat and poultry or, farm level. We also have our state and local governments that audit us, right? This is the basic entry to audits, is I am subject to regulatory inspection. So let's look at that. Well, what am I subject to, really? Well, if I meet the conditions of what constitutes a food under FDA, which is food, animal feed, that all falls under FSMA preventive controls. But maybe you're a very small supplier. You might have some exemptions, and you might not have to have all of the preventive controls in place, depending on your size. So even though, we'll talk about these more robust third-party audits later on in this presentation, when we're looking at it from a regulatory standpoint, that's not even created equal when it comes to all the food manufacturers out there in the industry. Even with food defense, the new FSMA food defense IAVA rule, it doesn't apply to warehouses. And you might have to have a plan, but you might not need a mitigation control. So it creates a great foundation, but we can't just leave it at that. USDA does a little bit different, of course. For our meat and poultry industry, they have the on-site inspector. So there is definitely more rigor in that. But at the end of the day, it's still the regulatory foundation for the US. For Canada, it would be CFIA. For Europe, of course, we've got European legislations, but they all have programs, right, that must recognize other countries. And so there is what we call Codex Alimentarius, which has set some global compliance parameters. And you might mostly be familiar with this when it comes to writing your HACCP plan, that your HACCP plan must be Codex compliant if you are entering into any of these third-party audit schemes. And we can kind of talk about that later, but essentially it sets a standard for international trade, fair and safe food internationally, on top of our normal regulatory audits, if of course we're exporting or entering into those additional third-party audits. So that's kind of the base. If we're building that triangle, this would be the base of that triangle. So what else? Who else audits? If we look to that next tier, it's usually those brand owners. Some of the first companies, no surprise, were the big names. Right here, I just grabbed some of the biggest names out there that started with developing their own brand standards, their own brand audits, things that went above and beyond the expectations of the federal government or the local health departments. What did they want to evaluate? Well, they wanted to look at not just your compliance to food safety, but also sometimes quality. What is your quality management? What's that facility design and hygiene level? They might even have specific standards around, you need to have a metal detector. They might require certain weight checks on their products, but their lens is very focused on how it impacts their product. And if I am selling to Kellogg's, that's going to look very different than if I'm selling to Nestle and if I have an infant formula or a baby food type product under that umbrella versus a cereal. And so we have to look at these standards as very specific to that particular brand, but we can't base our foundation of our entire program, unless that's your only customer, on how we establish what our day-to-day looks like in our facilities. So that's why those third-party audits were created. So many certification bodies like SCS have their own developed good manufacturing audits, that's where we get this term GMP audits. Although even when we look at the history of these GMP audits, now they're all HACCP based. They all require food defense to be in part of your program. They all have a higher level of expectation than just a simple checklist walking around the facility making sure you're doing good manufacturing practices, or if you're a warehouse, GDPs. So these level of third-party standards also have evolved and have become tougher. And they're still very much respected, and it's a great starting point for anybody on that journey. Maybe you're a small facility. That is something that ultimately, could be a great starting point. But we'll talk about some of the other options as well. Interesting enough, just to give you a little history, insiders actually credit Primus Labs with conducting the earliest third-party food safety audits on farms around in the 70s and 80s. And this was also focusing on limiting pesticide residues. And just so happened 40 years ago, right, that was also with our founder, Stan Rhodes, who, you know, had that demand for lab testing services and support. And so we, you know, have that legacy and having kind of pesticide-free claims and that our GMP standards. So we were in that in the very early days. So as I mentioned, we're not the most proactive country in terms of our regulatory and our reaction standards. And so unfortunately, that other precipice that I'm talking about that made us kind of shift to go, maybe these GMP audits that we're doing, or these brand audits that companies like Kellogg's and Hershey's and the like, you know, are not still at that level necessary for us to mitigate significant health hazards or brand reputational damage. One of those that really made the FDA wake up was the Peanut Corporation of America back in 2008 and 9 due to salmonella contaminated in their peanut products. And those peanut products then went into peanut butter crackers and raw materials and peanut butter products. And roughly, you know, we had about 714 least known illnesses and 9 deaths. And of course, we know the story of the Parnell guy, and of course he's in jail, and even the QA manager. There was a lot of nefarious things going on as well. It wasn't just poor food safety controls, it was also them willingly and knowingly. And so that is one of the reasons why we have FDA FSMA. Also, we can't, you know, look away and say, okay, well, we've got FSMA, everything is great. No, we still have recalls and outbreaks. We've got produce issues. You know, everyone remembers, of course, the romaine lettuce issue. Ice cream always seems every year there's one at least ice cream outbreak, unfortunately, with listeria. You know, these are lessons learned in the industry that we're still trying to get ahead of and have proactive controls in place. So with all that, at that same time, Walmart also back in 2008 decided that they're going to start requiring suppliers to receive a GFSI recognized certification. We'll talk about that in the next slide. So it's a retailer, right? The biggest retailer in the world at that time. You know, so they are saying to all of our suppliers, we're not willing to just accept regulatory compliance or these third-party GMP or a second-party audit. We need to move the bar. And GFSI was one of those that really helped us figure that out, and we'll talk about it more. Although luckily, in a couple years later, GFSI though did recognize that there are small and developing suppliers in the market that might not be able to fully achieve all of the expectations. And so they did launch their Global Markets Program, which we'll talk about as well. And then as we know, in 2016, FDA finalized the Food Safety Modernization Act, and they're still developing programs around that now under the new era of smarter food safety. So we have traceability requirements that are going to come out on those key type of products that are fall under it, and food safety culture. So this is evolving. So that base that we had, which used to be regulatory base, right now it's starting to get a little blurred. Now we're seeing our regulatory pick up with industry best practice expectations. Even to that point, FDA did an evaluation last year to determine if someone met the FSMA rules, would they be aligned to the third-party food safety standards? Generally, they said yes, but it's not a substitution. So you can't also say you're GFSI compliant and you're FDA compliant. You have to look at those both independently still as well. All right, so what is GFSI? The easiest way to think about this is that it is a broad set of recommendations that were made by the food industry They came together back in 2000 with key stakeholders, primarily internationally, and then luckily we started picking that up here in the US in the early 2000s as well. And they created these set of food safety standards with all those key stakeholders to create a benchmark. Why do we need a benchmark? Well, we need to be able to make sure they're to meet this goal, which is once certified, your audit is accepted everywhere, globally. And why is that important? Well, we're also burdened with many different audits, lots of different brand audits or GMP audit, or multiple different food safety schemes that are out there. So it was to create, if you chose an audit underneath this GFSI benchmark process, that audit would be accepted internationally, because it's all benchmarked and we're all working to pursue that higher level food safety within our organizations. But it is important to note that GFSI does not conduct audits. They don't hire auditors or certify food facilities. That is us, the certification bodies. We have to make sure that we're hiring the right auditors and we're certifying those food facilities. But there is somebody in between, which is the scheme holders. And those scheme holders tell us what we're auditing. They're also responsible for continuous improvement. So the Global Food Safety Initiative is actually going to be launching version 8 by the end of this year. And that will provide, hopefully, this is their words, a more consistent and harmonized approach, even further to enhance the high level of expectations expected of the schemes that are benchmarked under GFSI. So here are, some of the biggest ones you hear in the US, which is BRCGS, SQF, FSSC 22000, and then our more farm specialized pack houses, you might choose to go this direction around using Global GAP or Primus GFS. Ultimately, they all have their own unique character, and we'll talk a little bit about those differences and why you might choose one over the other. But they all go through a very rigorous framework of checks and balances that ensure the rigor and consistency of the audit, as well as us or any CB in the certification process. So not anybody can, be part of this scheme. They have a lot of processes to go through and accreditations as well. But how they vary, they can vary by their category and scope. So, your product might fall under a very specific code, for example, for SQF. Here I'm showing you the food manufacturing one, but there is also packaging. There is even a retail one, so they have it broken out. Whereas BRC, their food code, food safety scheme, or standard, I should say, has more within it. So their category and scope, so although they do have a separate packaging one and storage and distribution, but the food one is pretty much all encompassed within the food safety standard. About a minimum of 2 days is the starting point. That is the minimum. And then from there, your audit is dependent on the size of your facility, the number of employees, and how complex that category and scope is in terms of the number of HACCP plans. And I know this is probably one of the biggest pain points for many of you on this call that aren't under GFSI, which is you will have more audit days. And we'll explain kind of why and what that looks like. Auditors also must meet more rigorous approval process, must have experience on some of these standards and codes. They actually have to have a certain amount of minimum years of expertise and experience and pass tests in order to be able to even audit your facility. This is important because you don't want someone going into a a raw processing facility, auditing it the same way they would audit a ready-to-eat facility that could have a potential, for listeria in that product, whereas something that we have raw needs to be further processed or cooked. So we need to ensure that we hold not only those standards to that specific category and scope, but also the auditors. So that is kind of that trusted reason why GFSI benchmark schemes are important. So they did, as I mentioned, launch a while back the Global Markets Program, and they are currently actively have just kind of enhanced it as well. So we can send you links, but if you just go to GFSI, you can check out the Global Markets Program, and they have a toolkit now which shows you a company maybe starting on that journey, how to kind of build their food safety programs and what kind of training, and check their competency on the ability to get to that full-blown GFSI. Also, there are certain schemes that are recognized under this Global Markets Program. These are essentially for those small startup, maybe your very first audit, you're not quite ready for a full-blown GFSI. So there are now programs that you can start under those same owners, those same scheme hold owners, like BRCGS has what they call their Global Standard Start Audit. This START audit is broken up into basic and intermediate levels. SQF, same. They have their SQF fundamentals. They have a basic and an intermediate level as well. And there are some stepwise approach, even with Global Gap has that kind of stepwise journey. Why is this important? Well, perhaps you don't have the necessary resources to really be able to get where you need to go right away. This is a great way to shift from just a basic certification bodies, GMP and HACCP, and get on the journey to full GFSI certification. This means that you'll develop your programs against BRCs or SQF specific code. And then when you mature and are able to get more resources, or have a retailer that said, okay, I need you to get a GMP audit, but we only approve certain GMP audits. This is usually recognized under most retailers' supplier diversity programs for small and initial audits for companies. They accept the BRC STAR Intermediate, SQF Fundamentals Intermediate, for example, our GMP audit is accepted by most retailers as well. So there's a lot of different options for you, but I recommend for companies to get on this journey. That way you're one step ahead when you do have that customer or that retailer saying, no, I need you to move to GFSI compliance. Okay, so what I know you all came here for is, what is the difference? What would it take, right? 13% of you have, a current GMP audit. So if we use that as a benchmark, what does that look like if I were to move to full GFSI accredited scheme? Well, let's take a look at the first point, which is management commitment to food safety and regulatory compliance is expected everywhere. Regulatory, GMP, but what does it look like from a GFSI perspective? Well, all of those standards, whether we're talking Global Gap, Primus, BRCGS, they require that management commitment focus not just on the basics of food safety and regulatory compliance, but that you have a higher level of evaluation of your workforce around food safety culture. What things do we need to put in place? What CapEx, right? What capital investments do we need? What kind of KPIs or key performance indices we might need to put in place to really raise the bar. So management commitment and having a food safety policy and food safety culture at that little higher level and making sure that we understand where we want to go. Not everybody's going to be on that same journey. So it's not too bad. You just policy and food safety cultures, things that I think at the end of the day we want. And FDA is already building some fundamental food safety culture programs. Now, what about food safety policies and procedures? Well, depending on your organization, your size, the number of products you have, it roughly is about 20 or 30 policies and procedures that a GMP audit requires. We still have HACCP, still has food defense, it still has approved supplier program, all those things that you know and love. But if we move to GFSI, it does have more that is required. And this is just an estimate, but I'm roughly, when I develop a program and we go from GMP to GFSI, we have at least about 10 more policies and procedures, maybe up to 50, and that's more nuances. That's like, I've got approved supplier program, but then maybe I have a very specific receiving procedure or purchasing procedure. So don't let it scare you. It's just, yes, in the main, there is going to be some more policies and procedures that need to be part of your food safety and quality management program. From a regulatory perspective, all of the standards require Codex to be the base, and then to add on any food safety regulatory requirements. Now, the same with GFSI, although they do expect that it's not just basic food requirements, there's full implementation. That means, training, more than one person has HACCP training. Typically, it means that we have strong validation and verification activities to prove that our food safety plan is working correctly in the first place, and then those effective checks. And in the main, though, what you have in the GMP HACCP is a great foundation. It's just taking it to that next level to ensure that there is going to not be an issue with, say, an allergen label, incorrectly getting put on a product, right? So that's where those additional policies and procedures might come in to support it. GMP facility and hygiene inspection. When we go around and check the facility, we're looking that things are fit for purpose, good design. We don't have leaky buildings, that, we don't have rusty, filthy equipment, that it's fit for what the activity is being done. Those are basic no matter who is coming into your facility. Although for the GFSI, we now expect not just that GMP inspection, but a full internal audit program. This internal audit program means that you're going to look at not just your facility, but the entirety of your program. And that is broken out for BRCGS. It's broken out at minimum 4 times a year. With SQF, you need to make sure you've done everything based on risk and at least annually. So depending on the scheme, they do vary in terms of their expectation, but having internal audit training would also support moving in that direction and being able to meet this level of compliance. Records and traceability, bar none, everybody expects that. But for GFSI, if we have more policies and procedures and more robust programs, then yes, that does mean there is a bit more records and traceability, but there's creative solutions, right? And we can use electronic records. We can get a little bit closer to being able to make sure that we're not having to hire on a whole nother person just to manage the increase in records. There are ways to do it with your existing team, even if you're a team of 4 or 5. And I have clients that are very small. Their operation isn't any bigger than, a large size kitchen, and they're able to achieve SQF fundamentals or BRC start and on the journey to GFSI. So it is achievable. I mentioned food defense already, but for GFSI, they add some extra layers to it. They want you to also have a crisis management plan, and some GMP audits do require a crisis plan. and a food fraud. And now with FSMA, they do require you to take a look at economically motivated hazards anyways. So again, regulatory and GMP audits have already progressed and have gotten closer to GFSI than ever before. So, if we're nervous or scared about it's a lot to take on, actually, it's where the industry's going anyways. And wouldn't it be nice to be able to say I'm GFSI compliant? And that, goes for our basic requirements like allergen and just overall evolving our programs and implementation. And the only last thing on that is just the maturity. When you get to that GFSI, it's not just a one and done. Every time that auditor comes into your operation, they expect that you're continuously improving it, that it's living and breathing, and you're adding and changing and adapting when there are issues and when there's not issues, and we're just building more improvements and proactive programs. So you're probably thinking, well, what is the timeline? What is the impact, right? This seems like a lot, Denise. And I hear you, and it can be. But when we look at it just from a timeline perspective, facility that has a GMP HACCP audit, and if you've been doing that for many years, honestly, moving to maybe a start or a fundamentals or even to a GFSI, if you've been audited for many years, you're probably more than ready. You just have to maybe finesse a few things in your program. Although if your facility is new and you've only had maybe 1 or 2 GMP audits, is going to take you more time. Just from the basic standpoint that you probably don't have some of these more advanced programs built in. Also, in terms of resources, if you do have a dedicated resource to support already, you have QA manager, QC team, you have production that already supports a lot of the food safety initiatives, and it's not just the burden's all not on QA, then again, you're already ready from a resource standpoint, and it'll take you less time to transition. Now, I know some of you have consultants, and of course, that is well recognized as a great mechanism to be able to get you guys where you need to go. But if you're relying a little bit too heavy on your consultants to handle primary technical needs, then it is going to take a little bit more time to transition. Although those consultants, task them with, hey, help us help to get this done ourselves, right? The best consultants, in my opinion, are ones that give you the driving lesson and they turn it over to you, and they're not the one managing it on a day-to-day, weekly, or monthly basis. They're there to verify, they're there to validate things, they're there to push you forward, not to do the actual job. Now, if you already have a strong management commitment and everyone's like, we're in this, we're going to do this, and rally the team around it, then you're going to take less time because you're going to get that buy-in. Whereas if maybe we're not all bought into doing this because we're worried about the cost and the timeline and that uneasiness, and we've got to still get everyone's buy-in, then that's going to take more time. And then lastly, just the maturity of your food safety culture. Maybe, again, you've been audited for years and your team is ready, they get food safety, they're like, let's go. Then, they're already vested. Or maybe if you're a new business and it's still forming, or you're early on in your steps of trying to develop what it means to have a food safety culture, then that might also take you a little bit more time to make that transition. Why is it important though? I already talked about the customer requirements, right? I had a company that I talked to just this week, and they have a very big customer, and they need to move in this direction. But thankfully, that customer has a supplier diversity program, so they're going to get on that journey and hopefully get approved. Because then once you're approved, right, then you actually have that revenue to come in to support the growth of your program. But if you don't have that journey, if you don't have that third-party audit, then it's hard to be able to justify because you're not able to get those customers in the first place. So customer requirements are going to continue to increase. Also, why it's important, again, those GMP audits are not really basic anymore. They're pretty robust, and they still require full implementation of HACCP and many of the food safety policies and programs. So really just think about it as GFSI is just an advanced checklist of things that we need to implement within our program, but we already have a strong foundation because the GMP audits have progressed as well. Another key kind of importance as well as risk, again, is that technical support. We do need to have more skilled food safety and quality personnel in the workforce, and that does mean sometimes we have to train them on the job, right? Invest in training, get them HACCP trained, and make sure that they're PCQI if it's FDA, have them take the micro courses like root cause analysis or environmental monitoring. We need to invest in our team and our training and accountability, that it's not just QA, but it's production, it's maintenance, it's purchasing. Everybody has a part in the audit program. It's not one department or one person's responsibility. And that'll really help shift the dynamics in your organization. And then management commitment, of course, as we talked about. All right, so let's just stop for a minute before we move to our additional strategies and ask you guys another question. What is the biggest hurdle in moving to GFSI? So let me open this next one here. Okay, should be open. So we kind of guessed at some of them, right? Might be management commitment, technical resources, time commitment, cost. Or if there's something we didn't quite think about, just go ahead and throw those in the comment field, and then I can take a look at that when we get to the Q&A time frame. You guys another 10 seconds. All right, I'll go ahead and close that poll and then share the results. Got a lovely little histogram here. So as expected, right, 33% time commitment, right? So, we'll talk about some strategies around this and how do you invest that time to do it. I think, whenever we tackle something new, if we don't dedicate time, or if we've got a project, if we don't dedicate time, it can kind of shift, and all of a sudden we're like, well, we want to get audited by August, and now all of a sudden it's August, maybe December, right? We'll talk about project planning. 22% management commitment, right? Yes, absolutely. How do we, maybe many of you are technical, team members out there that you want to move in this direction. So how do you talk to management? How do you get their buy-in? Maybe management's bought in, but they just don't know too, like, what does it really mean? So we'll talk some strategies around that. And then 15% divided between technical resource, another 15% cost. So those are always, no matter what audit scheme you have, those two are always going to be kind of our base struggles. And sometimes we have all the technical support in the world, and then next week we're, down half of our team or something of that nature, right? And now, have we built redundancies? Those are the type of hurdles we have to kind of proactively look at, even for businesses that already have 54% of you are already GFSI compliant. So you already know those. And then, yes, the cost of quality, right? I had an early question that came into me this week on cost. What does it really take? How do we really measure the cost? And when we look at, if you go to, the various websites and look up cost of quality, right? And they have the beautiful diagram that shows, right? if you don't invest, in quality, and this goes back to, the car industry when they started first developing the quality of cost. If you don't invest in that, then, inferior product and one nonconformance, right? One issue can then supersede all of those costs that if we would have proactively invested, we would have never had those deviations. So that's a great quality course that maybe we'll do in the future. Okay, so let's go ahead and hide that, and let's take a look at some strategies, and then leave you guys some time here for questions. Okay, so some strategies to move from GMP to GFSI. The first thing I always get is, well, what scheme should I select? Okay, so we're the certification body. We're not going to tell you, can't kind of point you in the right direction. We sort of can, but at the end of the day, it's your site's responsibility to determine what's the best fit. But I can, as a consultant, I can give you some kind of advice in this category. So I would say, first look at, well, what is your category and your scope? And look at the BRCGS standard, look at SQF's code, look at the, if you're a grower, pack house, you'll want to look at the difference between global gap and Primus. And ultimately determine what looks like the best fit. Where would you fit in their category and their scope? And then look at the standard, look at the code, kind of flip through it. You can download these codes off their websites. These are, public information. We're happy to send it as well, and really see what looks like it might be a good fit for your industry. So that's a one direction. The other one might be, customer type. I know a lot of people that call me up and say, oh, we need to be SQF audited because a retailer told us. I'm like, okay, well, they probably said you need to be SQF because that buyer only knows that scheme, but actually GFSI has many approved schemes. And we just get those buzzwords or acronyms in our head, and we here in the US sometimes don't realize that there are more because of publicity, right? So it's important that we do look at all of the GFSI schemes and choose the one that makes sense, because yes, if the retailer accepts SQF, they're going to accept BRCGS as well, or Global Gap, or Primus GFS, FSSC 22000, those IFS, which is another one. There's a lot of different types, but remember, one audit accepted everywhere. There might also be just familiarity with the scheme. Maybe in your past company, you guys had BRCGS. Maybe you had Primus without the full-blown GFSI. So familiarity is great because then you already have a working knowledge and a perspective on kind of what you're already going into. One of the things I didn't note here, but I would recommend, is ask your peers. What are they getting? Take a look at maybe your industry. So for example, a lot of my flavor clients, they all choose BRC. A lot of raw material suppliers choose BRC. And why? Because it's very risk-based, and in their opinion, it fits well with what they're doing from a raw material standpoint and the high-level facility and design expected of that scheme. So we have to look at, do we want something prescriptive, or do we want something a little bit more risk-based that we can kind of fit what we need into our overall program based on our business needs. But do note, some of them do require quality, and it's not just food safety. We have to also look at quality. Also, availability of resources and auditors. That's also always important. You can call us at SCS or any CB and get quotes, get an understanding of where their auditors are, right? Do they have auditors that meet that scheme? They'll, of course, they'll tell you, what their ability is and which schemes that they can handle. Also, a lot of people like the difference between the scoring. That ends up being a deciding factor. So, you know, some of them have a percent score, some of them have an alphabetical score. So, you know, look at the scoring type if that perhaps is also just one factor of many. But just note, they all require unannounced cycles. So that's not a distinction anymore. So they're all basically 1 and 3 require unannounced. Even now, some of our GMP audits are requiring unannounced because of certain retailer requirements. Okay. So the second strategy, once you've decided, okay, I know what scheme I want to go into, or at least, you know, start that journey, training. Can't, you know, talk more about the importance of more than just one person getting HACCP trained in your organization. Build those redundancies. I've trained owners of businesses all the way to, you know, sanitation teams on HACCP. Really, you know, where an organization has a strong foundation for everyone having that base knowledge, even if they're not writing the HACCP plan, but they've gone through the training, that creates also that food safety culture. It creates a better understanding of why they're doing what they're doing. If you're FDA, you would also, you know, need the preventive controls, or if you're produce, the produce safety, you know, training in order to make sure you're FSMA compliant. And then once you've also selected that scheme, make sure to sign up at least one. Again, it might need 2 people to be formally trained on BRCGS or SQF or Global Gap. Whenever there's a new version too, we want to make sure people get refresher training. So this is when we look at the cost, I will always raise my hand and say, put more money in the training bucket. It'll pay off in the end because people will be more risk aware. They'll hopefully then also that cost of quality goes up, where then we have reduced non-conformances because we've expanded the knowledge of our team. That includes just topic specific and you know, those improved trainings for all team members. So they have the base knowledge for things like food defense and food fraud, and of course, food safety culture. The third thing is to conduct a gap assessment. So download that scheme and checklist. As I mentioned, you can download these. If you can't find them, reach out to me. I'll send it directly to you. Conduct an internal audit against those requirements, against your current programs, and see how far your gap is. That's basically what it is. Once you identify those gaps, then you can put an improvement plan in place and build to that program. The beauty is when you do this gap assessment, this actually counts as part of your internal audit program. And you can even hire a consultant to come in and do this that's experienced in that scheme, that can then help you develop a reasonable timeline to close the gaps. The worst thing that you could do is say, we're going to get audited in August and have not done a gap assessment. You don't actually know what's needed to get there. Or someone said, okay, you need to be third-party audited by the end of the year. Great. This, again, is a great place to start, so then you can build out that full program management of it. And the fourth one is to register and select your audit date to make sure that, as I mentioned, you have an audit date on the books. If you don't start the journey, you know, once you've done the gap assessment, you know when you have an idea of now when you can get audited. Don't wait till you're ready. Make sure you get that audit date in the books. Contact the certification body. You have to register with the scheme owner. We'll talk you through the whole process. Get the quotes. Make sure you're selecting and confirming that audit date. So then that way everyone is committed and communicated that this is what we're trying to achieve, and it doesn't just drift, because that's what I see happens most cases. Now you might be, you know, 30 days out and say, okay, you're not ready. Well, usually most CBs, you know, will allow for that adjustment as long as there's a significant amount of time. Usually it's about 30-day notification that, hey, actually we're not quite ready. So we'll work with you. And that management commitment. what are some of these bullet points? And you guys will get a copy of this presentation. And with that, what do we need to do? Well, we need to document our monthly and annual team meetings. Make sure that, you know, with GFSI that we're documenting, we're getting credit for already the things that we're doing. We need to write that food safety policy. It needs to speak about your vision, your mission, what you're trying to achieve, and it's signed by the most responsible person for the site. That shows that management commitment. And have open discussions about the challenges and timelines. Develop a risk-based plan and then implement and ensure everyone has their role and responsibility in ensuring what we need to do to get fully compliant. Lastly, make sure that you're, as a team, you do that facility walkthrough. Make sure you go through and document all the facility design and hygiene and things that need to be fixed. And again, put a plan in that. Maybe the floor, for example, is not the best. Well, you can put a program in place where you can put mitigation strategies. It doesn't mean you need to put a brand new floor down for a GFSI audit. It means you need to show that that floor isn't going to create a biological or foreign material issue, and that you have mitigation strategies in place. It's more flexible than I think you guys probably realize. It doesn't have to be, all stainless steel, beautiful, top to bottom pharmaceutical level, right? It needs to be fit for purpose. It needs to be based on risk. It needs to ensure it meets those requirements for food safety and quality. And lastly, the best thing management commitment can do is to engage and empower all of their team at all levels. And that's part of that food safety culture. Okay. So what is the measure of success? Fully developed, implemented food safety management system program, all of these things in place, ability to react fast, and ultimately maintain brand trust and reputation. Also that continuous improvement mindset and a team that really is audit ready every day, regardless if you're GMP or GFSI fully compliant. These are measures of success for any audit scheme. Okay, so as I mentioned, we do have our robust training calendar for public, private, and on-demand interactive training. We offer lots of consulting services, so reach out to me. Happy to direct you to the right people as well. And let's take a look at your questions. I know I'm running low on time here. Obviously, I could talk a lot more about this, and we're very passionate. All right, so let's open these questions. And again, if you have to hop off, I will definitely get to these questions remotely as well. Okay, just have a difficulty here and be able to see these. There we go. Okay. So we have a Costco food safety audit, gluten-free certification and plant-based. How difficult will it be to, meet that GFSI? So yes, so Costco food safety audits are very equivalent to other CB GMP audits. And so, what would it take to get to GFSI? I think it is exactly, if you go to that one slide where I kind of showed the differences, the best thing to do is to first pick that scheme and then do that gap assessment. That'll allow you to then have a better understanding on what exactly it might take for you to be able to move in that direction. Okay, is that the only question? I think so. Let me see if I pop this. Oh, here we go. Sorry, geez, now I can see it. Okay. Primus GFS Global Gap for farms and pack houses. Yes, exactly. That is usually our go-to. It's more specific, it's risk-based, it fits you guys better than, BRCGS scheme and SQF, although they do have those programs. But we have a full team that can help you understand the difference even between Primus GFS and Global Gap. So reach out to us and we're happy to walk you through that. Now, USDA harmonized gap audit, it's not GFSI benchmarked. That's a regulatory audit. But again, it's a strong foundation for start. It can be accepted as part of the overall retail. Some retailers will accept it, but you definitely want to start kind of looking at how do you then progress into, say, for example, a Primus GFS or a global gap. Is BRCGS Start only available for food manufacturers or agents and brokers? Great question. I will get back to you on that. I know the Start, yeah, definitely has for the food safety. Do they have the equivalent for agent and brokers? I don't know, but I will definitely get back to you on that. Staffing, yes, staffing is one of those issues in terms of the questions of concern, right? And that's where you want to make sure that you have a cross-functional team, that everybody has their kind of role and responsibility. And it's not just trying to, create one person or one team that's responsible for this. Is it possible to be SQF certified on one line of production, even though you have many other lines? Thank you. That's a great question, Joel. You can have exemptions to the scope of your audit. Although the entire facility will have to be audited. The auditor will review the entire facility no matter what production line is that specific product or category. And also there are other kind of decision trees there. If you're making the same product on another line and it's similar and it's the same food safety plan, then that's not like an acceptable exemption. So when you submit your application for certification, let them know what you want in scope and what you want not in scope, and then the certification body's team, technical advisor, will let you know what isn't allowable. So for example, maybe I'm doing e-commerce in my warehouse. I'm going to exclude that, but the auditor still will have to go around to make sure that e-commerce activity isn't impacting the production of our products, for say. Okay, and yes, if you're trying to transition from ISO 22000 to FSSC 22000 V6, think that's a great point, right? Some people think, oh, ISO 22000 is benchmarked. It's a GFSI scheme. It's not actually. You have to get the FSSC 22000 version, and we are on version 6. So what you want to do is download that checklist and do your gap assessment. So then you know kind of how much work you might need to transition. I'm not an FSSC expert, so but you can definitely reach out to them for more information as well. Do you need to be certified by an outside body to be an internal auditor? So part of the GFSI scheme does require that whoever is the main lead internal auditor does need to, have the experience and education to understand how to internal audit. Usually that means to go through a training. Like next week, I'm doing a BRC internal auditor training. We have SQF, we have general internal audit training. It's a unique skill set. Just because you're skilled in HACCP plan development and program development doesn't mean you're skilled at being able to audit against that. So even though there's a rough definition of what's required, most everybody has at least one person formally internal audit trained, and then that internal audit team either gets formally trained, or that person that has the certificate will then give them like necessary training to do their activities. Let's see, I know we're over, but you guys a lot of you are still here, so I'm just going to answer a few more of these questions, and then we'll respond to the rest via email. Regarding food defense, what are your thoughts on using protective security advisors, conduct vulnerability assessment? So FSMA does allow you to use external providers to help develop your food defense plan, and do a vulnerability assessment, but the implementation and mitigation has to be done at the site. I'm not familiar with the ones you've specifically mentioned, but make sure it does if you are FDA, that is following the vulnerability assessment program, the IAVA program, and that they're not using some old Carver method or something that actually isn't aligned. Lastly, how do you become SCIP practitioner for your company? You have to be HACCP certified, and I would strongly encourage you, even though it's not required, to do the SQF implementation training. So it's a 16-hour training, and we go through from front to back of the code, and same for BRC. Although not required, highly encouraged. It's investment. And yes, I will be sending out the recording of this webinar within the next day or two or so. And thank you guys all for your questions. I know this is a lot to digest, but we will continue the conversation. You can reach out to me. And if you would like to start an application in that journey, you can reach out to our sales team. All right, thank you all. And we do have a survey at the end, so it'd be great to hear a little bit more from you, and have a great rest of your day.